A retired Navy SEAL stood by the river on a frozen morning, staring at the water like it might answer something he never learned how to ask. The war was over. His uniform was gone. Everyone said he made it home. But there are losses you don't bury. They just sit with you, quietly. He learned how to survive without them. What he never learned was how to live. And then, one winter day, out of the fog and steel-gray air, something familiar returned, not to bring back the past, but to pull him back from giving up on the present. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. The river moved slowly that morning, dark and cold, brushing against the concrete edge as if it had all the time in the world. The air carried the smell of rust and wet steel from the abandoned shipyard upriver. Gulls circled without urgency. Nothing here asked to be noticed. Caleb Ward stood near the railing, hands tucked into the pockets of a worn jacket that used to mean something. Years ago, mornings like this were filled with briefings, routes, voices overlapping in controlled tension. Now there was only the water, the echo of a distant buoy, and the quiet pressure of time stretching too wide. He had been forced out early, the kind of retirement no one celebrates. Too many injuries stacked too close together. A decision made in a clean office, far from sand and smoke. One day he was still useful. The next he was thanked and sent home with a handshake that lasted a second too long. People assumed that was the hard part, losing the uniform, losing the mission. They were wrong. The hard part came later, in the small hours of the day, when there was no one to report to, no reason to check the weather twice, no reason to wake up before dawn except habit. Caleb still rose early every morning, as if someone might call his name. They never did. He lived near the river now, in a converted storage building that still smelled faintly of oil and old rope. The place was quiet, too quiet. At night, the walls creaked with temperature shifts, and the wind slipped through gaps no one bothered to seal. Caleb never fixed them. The cold gave him something to register. He walked the same stretch each day, past the rusted fences, past the skeletal frames of old boats that would never touch water again. His boots moved at a measured pace, careful without thinking about it. Even now, his body scanned before his mind caught up. That was the strange thing about life after war. The body remembered more than the man wanted it to. A sudden metallic clang from the shipyard made his shoulders tense. Not visibly, just enough. The sound faded, replaced by the river again. Anyone watching would have missed it. Caleb didn't. He leaned on the railing and watched the current drag bits of ice downstream. He wasn't thinking about the past. Not directly. It was more like the past was thinking about him. There are connections the brain doesn't treat as memories. They live deeper than thought. During combat, those connections are built for speed and survival. One mind divided into roles. One part watching angles, another listening, another trusting something beyond sight to sense danger first. For Caleb, that part had never belonged to him alone. Training had taught his brain to rely outward, to hand over certain instincts. Over time, that reliance stopped feeling like teamwork and started feeling like anatomy. Not a partner, an extension. When that connection was cut, the brain didn't file it under loss. It filed it under absence, like a limb that should. Still respond, but doesn't. That was why the quiet hurt more than the noise ever had. Caleb could stand in line at a grocery store without flinching. He could make small talk. He could smile at the cashier and mean it. But a sudden whistle of wind through broken metal could hollow him out in seconds. Not because it reminded him of anything specific, because something inside him reached outward and found nothing there. He didn't talk about it. There wasn't language for this kind of gap. You couldn't explain how part of your nervous system had learned to expect a presence that was no longer there. You couldn't explain how your body still waited for signals that would never come. So he didn't try. Instead, he kept walking, kept his routine small and predictable. Coffee at the same hour, meals eaten standing up, sleep taken lightly, always listening. Some mornings he sat by the river longer than planned, watching fog lift and settle again. The mist softened the outlines of the world, blurring edges, making distance feel unreliable. Caleb liked that. It matched the way time behaved now. He told himself this was normal, that people adjusted, that eventually the waiting would stop. But the body doesn't unlearn survival on a schedule. It remembers pressure. It remembers trust. It remembers what kept you alive when nothing else could. Caleb straightened as a low horn sounded somewhere far downriver, a cargo vessel announcing itself to no one in particular. His breath caught before he noticed it had changed. The sound passed. The water closed over its echo. He stayed where he was, hand resting on cold metal, eyes fixed on the current. The war was over. Everyone agreed on that. But standing there, listening to the river, Caleb understood something he had never said out loud. Some soldiers don't come back broken. They come back incomplete, and the world moves too slowly to notice what's missing. At night, the river sounded different. During the day, it moved slow and patient, like it was thinking things through. But after dark, when the fog settled low and the wind slid through broken beams along the docks, the water carried sharper edges. Small slaps against metal, hollow knocks from somewhere beneath the surface. Caleb heard all of it. Some nights he stood by the window, lights off, listening. Not because he was afraid, because part of him was still waiting for something to answer back. He noticed it in his body before he noticed it in his thoughts. A sudden clatter of loose chains would make his hand tighten at his side. The scrape of ice against concrete would pull his shoulders back, just slightly, as if bracing. Once, a stray dog barked somewhere down the block, and Caleb found himself holding his breath without knowing why. It wasn't sadness, not the kind people expect. Sadness comes with tears, with names, with moments you can point to and say, "That's what hurts." This was different. This was his nervous system reaching outward and finding silence. In the years he worked with a K-9, his brain had learned a new language. A quiet one. It trusted signals that never needed words. The shift of weight. The pause before movement. The instinct that said danger before sight ever confirmed it. Over time, those signals didn't feel external anymore. They felt internal. Like balance. Like breath. When that connection was gone, his brain didn't grieve it the way it grieves a memory. It treated it like a function that had failed to return, a reflex that fired into empty space. That's why the world felt wrong in small ways. Caleb could sit in a crowded diner and feel completely alone. He could walk past people laughing and feel untouched by it. Not because he didn't care, but because the part of him that used to sync with another living presence had nowhere to land. On nights when the rain turned to sleet, he barely slept. The sound of ice tapping against the window came in uneven rhythms. Tap, pause, drag. His mind didn't connect it to weather. His body interpreted it as movement. He would sit up in bed, eyes open, scanning shadows that hadn't changed. Sometimes he felt watched. Not in a fearful way, more like a familiar pressure at his back, the sense that someone was there, steady and alert, covering what he couldn't see. He never turned around. It wasn't a ghost he was afraid of. It was the disappointment of finding nothing. Caleb learned to live with these moments by shrinking his world. Smaller routes, predictable sounds, fewer variables. The river, at least, was honest. It never pretended to be quiet. On one particular evening, the fog rolled in thick and low, swallowing the far end of the dock. A distant foghorn sounded, long and mournful, carrying through the cold air. Caleb stopped walking without realizing he had done it. The sound vibrated somewhere deep in his chest. His heart rate changed. His jaw tightened, his eyes fixed on the white space ahead. The horn faded, leaving the river breathing again. Caleb stayed where he was, boots planted, breath slow but deliberate. Moments like this didn't come with explanations. They came with residue, a tension that lingered long after the sound had passed. His body didn't know how to stand down from something it had once relied on to survive. People told him time would fix it. They said the mind learns to adapt, that instincts fade when they're no longer needed. What they didn't understand was that some bonds aren't stored in memory. They're wired into response. Caleb didn't miss companionship in the way people talk about missing company. He missed alignment. The quiet certainty that something beside him was seeing what he couldn't, that the space behind him was accounted for. On nights when sleep wouldn't come, he sat on the edge of his bed and rested his hands on his knees, grounding himself in the present. Cold floor, steady breath. Stillness. Sometimes he whispered a name without sound, just to feel how it moved inside him. Nothing answered. And yet something remained. A readiness without an object. A trust without a receiver. The bond hadn't disappeared. It had gone quiet. And in that silence, Caleb lived suspended between who he had been and who he didn't yet know how to become. Outside, the river kept moving. The fog thickened, then thinned. Somewhere in the distance, metal shifted against metal, and the sound carried low across the water. Caleb stood and walked back toward home, every step measured, every sense awake. Not because danger was near, but because some part of him still believed it was never truly alone. The fog came in low that afternoon, rolling off the river in thick sheets that erased distance. The far end of the dock disappeared first, then the outlines of the cranes. Even the water lost its edges, turning into a flat, pale surface that reflected nothing back. Caleb slowed his steps without realizing it. He had walked this path hundreds of times. The rusted rail, the warped planks, the same scatter of gravel near the bend. His body knew it better than his mind ever did. But that day, something in the air felt misaligned, as if the space ahead of him was holding its breath. He stopped. Across the dock, near the shadow of the old warehouse, stood a man he didn't recognize. Older, broad-shouldered, still in the way he carried himself, not in how he moved. One hand held a leash, loose, almost careless. At the end of it sat a dog, large, still, watching. Caleb didn't step closer. He didn't speak. His chest tightened, but his face stayed calm. Training held. Habit held. He took in details instead. The coat was darker than he remembered, thicker around the neck. One ear carried a faint notch near the edge. The posture was alert but reserved, weight evenly distributed, as if ready but unwilling. The dog didn't react. No pull at the leash, no raised head, no shift forward, just stillness. Caleb told himself it meant nothing. There were other dogs like this, similar build, similar eyes, similar way of holding space. He had learned that lesson the hard way, more than once. Expectation was dangerous. Hope was worse. He stayed where he was, boots planted, hands relaxed at his sides. The man said nothing. He only watched Caleb with a look that didn't push or invite. The fog drifted between them, thickening, thinning, as if undecided. The dog's gaze moved briefly, not toward Caleb, toward the river. Caleb swallowed. He didn't say the name. He had promised himself he never would. Not again. Not without certainty. Names carried weight. They demanded answers. And he had learned what it felt like to speak into silence. A gull cried somewhere overhead. The sound echoed off metal and vanished. The dog remained unmoved. Seconds passed, maybe longer. Caleb felt foolish for standing there, for letting his pulse change, for feeling that familiar pressure at his back, the sense of something aligning where it shouldn't. He shifted his weight, just slightly. The dog's ears flicked. That was all. Not recognition, not acknowledgement, just a response to movement. Caleb looked away. He had already lost this once. He wasn't going to lose it again by reaching too far. That was when the sound came. Low, distant, drawn out. The river horn. It rolled across the water slowly, cutting through the fog in a long, steady note. Not loud, not urgent, just present. The kind of sound meant to guide things home when sight failed. Caleb froze. The dog's head lifted. Not sharply, not all at once. As if something old had been stirred awake. The posture changed first. The spine straightened. The weight shifted forward by a fraction. The leash went taut. The man tightened his grip without looking down. The horn sounded again, closer this time, vibrating through the dock, through the metal beams, through the water itself. The dog stood, slowly, deliberately. Its eyes locked onto Caleb, not searching, not confused, focused. Caleb felt the world narrow. His breath stopped halfway in. His hands curled without permission. He didn't step forward. He couldn't. His legs refused the instruction as if they understood something his mind had not caught up to yet. The dog took one step, then another. The leash slipped from the man's hand. Caleb didn't hear it hit the ground. All he could see was the way the dog moved now. The angle of approach, the caution layered over certainty, the way it stopped just short of touching distance, head tilted slightly, eyes steady. Waiting, not for a command, for confirmation. Caleb's throat tightened. He still didn't say the name. He didn't need to. The dog's tail moved once. Low, controlled, familiar. The horn faded into silence. The fog closed in again, soft and heavy, wrapping the dock in white. Caleb stood motionless, heart pounding so hard it felt audible, staring at a living shape he had buried years ago without a body. His mind searched for explanations. Coincidence, training, memory playing tricks. His body found none of them convincing. He lowered himself slowly, one knee touching the cold wood of the dock, eyes never leaving the dog's face. The dog leaned forward, pressed its forehead gently against Caleb's chest, and exhaled. Caleb didn't cry. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He simply closed his eyes, one hand rising to rest against a familiar warmth as the world finally went quiet in the one place it never had before. There was a question that always followed moments like this. It lingered in the silence, heavy and unavoidable. How did he come back? Caleb didn't ask it out loud. He stayed where he was, one hand still resting against Atlas's shoulder, feeling the slow, steady rise of breath beneath thick fur. The world had narrowed to this point of contact, this proof of warmth. But somewhere beyond the fog, the question waited. The man who had held the leash cleared his throat softly. Not to interrupt, just to announce that he was there. His name was Henry. He spoke slowly, like someone who had learned that rushing never helped. He didn't start at the beginning. He started with the moment that mattered to him. A cold morning near Spokane. Rain falling straight down, turning dust into mud. A stretch of road most people passed without noticing. Atlas had been standing near a scrapyard, ribs showing through his coat, one paw lifted slightly off the ground. Not aggressive, not afraid, just waiting. Henry said the dog didn't bark, didn't growl, didn't move when the truck pulled over. He only watched, eyes steady as if measuring whether this human was worth the effort of hope. Henry had seen that look before, in mirrors, in other men who came back changed and learned to stand still in the world. He opened the truck door. Atlas climbed in on his own. There were no calls made that day, no reports filed, no one waiting on the other end of a phone line. Henry drove until the rain thinned and the road stretched out ahead of them, quiet and gray. Atlas slept with one eye open. The days that followed were small and unremarkable. Food placed carefully on the floor, water bowls filled and refilled, a blanket laid down without ceremony. Atlas ate slowly, like someone who had learned not to trust abundance. Henry didn't ask where he came from, People who had seen war knew better than to demand explanations from survivors. They traveled light, back roads, gas stations that didn't ask questions, nights spent parked near rivers or rest stops where the hum of passing traffic kept memories at bay. Sometimes Atlas would sit upright in the truck, ears alert, staring into nothing. Henry never touched him when that happened. He had learned that stillness was sometimes the kindest response. There were moments when Atlas pulled toward certain sounds. A distant horn, metal shifting against metal, the low echo of engines moving through fog. Henry followed when he could, waited when he couldn't. They moved west slowly, not with purpose, but with patience. There was no paperwork, no transport order, no official return, just a series of open doors. A woman at a feed store who offered a bag of dog food without charge. A mechanic who fixed a tire and waved away payment. A man at a rest stop who shared half his sandwich without asking why. Atlas accepted kindness the way he accepted everything else. Carefully, without urgency. He didn't belong to anyone during that time. Not really. He was in between. Henry said the dog never tried to run, never resisted, but he also never settled completely. Like part of him was still listening for something specific, something he couldn't name. Winter came early that year. The roads grew slick, the nights colder. Atlas pressed closer to the heater, his breathing even, his body slowly filling back out. But the waiting never left his eyes. Henry noticed it most when they stopped near water, rivers, harbors, places where sound carried differently. That was when Atlas seemed most awake. One morning, Henry followed him to the edge of a dock not unlike this one, fog thick enough to hide the far shore. A horn sounded low and long across the water. Atlas had frozen, not in fear, in recognition. That was when Henry understood that the dog wasn't lost. He was oriented. He was moving toward something, guided by a map that wasn't written down anywhere. So Henry kept driving, kept stopping, kept listening, until the road ended where it needed to. Back on the dock, the fog shifted again, pulling away just enough to reveal the river's slow movement. Caleb listened without looking at Henry now. He already knew which parts mattered. This hadn't been a rescue. It had been a return. One that didn't follow the rules people like to imagine. No flags, no speeches, no one waiting with certainty on the other side. Atlas hadn't been brought home. He had found his way back, one decision at a time, through people who understood that sometimes survival doesn't come with instructions. Henry finished speaking and fell quiet. Atlas stayed pressed against Caleb, solid and warm and undeniably present. Caleb closed his eyes, not to escape the moment, but to stay inside it. The journey back hadn't been loud, it hadn't been clean, but it had been real. And somehow, that made it enough. The weather turned without warning. Rain thickened into sleet, and sleet into a heavy, wet snow that clung to everything it touched. The river darkened, its surface broken by sharp wind and drifting ice. The dock lights flickered once, then steadied, casting long, trembling reflections across the water. Caleb noticed the sound before anything else. Not a shout, not a siren. Metal grinding against stone. A low, strained noise carried through the storm, followed by a horn that cut short as if swallowed by the fog. Atlas lifted his head. His body changed in an instant. Muscles tightened, ears angled forward. The stillness that usually wrapped him fell away, replaced by something older, sharper. Across the river, a small workboat sat tilted at an unnatural angle, its bow caught against the rocks near the shoreline. Water slapped hard against its side. Figures moved on deck, blurred by snow and distance. A child's voice carried faintly across the wind. Caleb felt his chest lock. For a moment, he did what he had practiced for months. He stayed still. He told himself it wasn't his responsibility, that there were phones, authorities, systems built for moments like this. He was just a man standing near a river, no uniform, no clearance, no obligation. Atlas didn't wait. The leash slipped from Caleb's hand as the dog moved forward, fast and certain, boots of snow crunching behind him. Atlas stopped at the edge of the dock, staring into the fog, gauging distance and current like a calculation he didn't need to think about. Caleb called his name once. Not a command. A reflex. Atlas didn't look back. The horn sounded again, longer this time, the vibration rolling through the water and into Caleb's bones. The same sound from years ago. A signal meant to be answered. Caleb exhaled through clenched teeth and followed. The cold hit him first. Water soaked through his jacket as he waded closer, boots slipping on slick boards. The air smelled of fuel and wet rope. Shouts grew clearer now, panic layered with exhaustion. 2 men clung to the rail of the boat, trying to keep it from turning further. A woman held a child against her chest, her arms locked tight, eyes wide but focused. Atlas reached the waterline and stopped again, scanning. Caleb saw it then. This wasn't chaos to the dog. It was terrain. Atlas moved along the edge, testing footing, nose low, ears alert. He found a narrow stretch where the current slowed, where the rocks broke the force of the water. Without hesitation, he stepped in. Caleb felt the decision land in his body before it reached his mind. He rolled up his sleeves and followed. The water was numbing. Every step sent sharp pain up his legs. He kept his eyes on Atlas, matching his pace, trusting the dog's instincts more than his own judgment. They reached the boat just as it lurched again. One of the men slipped. Caleb caught him by the arm, the weight nearly pulling them both into the water. Atlas braced himself, pressing his body against the man's legs, giving Caleb the leverage he needed. No words were exchanged. There was no time for them. The child came first. Wrapped tight, lifted carefully, passed from shaking arms into steadier ones. Atlas stayed planted, his body a barrier against the current, eyes locked on the water's surface. The woman followed, then the second man. Each movement felt measured, deliberate, as if the storm itself had slowed to allow it. When the boat finally settled, empty and quiet, the river seemed to release a breath it had been holding. They stood together on the shore, soaked and silent. Snow clung to Atlas's fur in heavy clumps. Caleb's hands shook as the cold set in, his heart pounding with an intensity he hadn't felt in years. The child began to cry, the sound thin but alive. Caleb knelt, steadying himself with one hand on the wet ground. He looked at Atlas, really looked at him, standing there calm and unmoved by praise or fear. Atlas met his gaze. For a brief moment, the years between them disappeared. Caleb realized something he hadn't allowed himself to consider. He hadn't chosen to come back to this life. He had been pulled into it. Not by duty, not by orders, by the simple fact that someone else needed him. The storm continued to fall around them, quiet now, almost respectful. Atlas stepped closer to Caleb's side, close enough that their shoulders touched. Neither of them moved. Some choices aren't made with words. They are made by stepping forward when everything in you wants to stay still. The storm moved on, leaving behind a quieter kind of damage. The dock was empty again. The river returned to its slow, deliberate rhythm. Snow softened the edges of everything it touched, as if trying to erase what had just happened. Caleb stood near the railing, his jacket still damp, his hands wrapped around a paper cup someone had pressed into them without asking. The heat barely registered. His eyes followed Atlas, who lay a few steps away, calm now, head resting on his paws. No one spoke for a while. People passed by in ones and twos. A man offered a nod. A woman pulled her coat tighter and kept walking. Gratitude didn't announce itself. It lingered quietly, unsure where to land. Henry stood nearby, hands in his pockets, shoulders slightly hunched against the cold. He didn't say much. He never did. He watched Atlas the way someone watches a fire after it's done its work, careful not to disturb the embers. Across the path, Eleanor appeared with her familiar slow steps. She carried a small bag of bread, the kind she always brought for the birds by the river. She stopped when she saw Caleb, then Atlas, then the wet ground and the lingering tension in the air. She didn't ask what happened. She set the bag down beside the bench and waited. Eleanor had been a teacher once, the kind who believed silence could teach as much as words. She stood with her hands folded, eyes soft as if she were witnessing something sacred without needing to name it. People often talk about angels as if they arrive with light and certainty, as if they come to fix things. But the truth looked more like this. A man who stopped his truck one rainy morning and opened a door. A woman who showed up every day, rain or shine, to sit beside strangers and feed birds that didn't remember her name. A dog who didn't speak, didn't hesitate, didn't need permission to step forward. None of them looked extraordinary. That was the point. Caleb watched Atlas breathe, the steady rise and fall grounding him more than any prayer ever had. He realized something then, standing there in the cold. These people had all stood where he once stood, on the far side of loss. Henry had lost friends he never talked about. Eleanor had buried a husband years ago and learned to keep living without answers. Atlas had waded through hunger and uncertainty without knowing if anyone would come back for him. They weren't angels because they saved the day. They were angels because they stayed. They stayed when the noise faded, when the crowds moved on, when the story stopped being interesting. Eleanor stepped closer and rested a gloved hand on the bench. The wood was damp and cold, worn smooth by time. She didn't sit. She just stood there, sharing the moment. "Some things don't need explaining," she said quietly, more to herself than anyone else. Caleb nodded. He felt different now. Not healed, not fixed, but adjusted, like something inside him had shifted, just enough to let air back in. Atlas lifted his head and looked at him, eyes steady, untroubled. No expectation, no demand, just presence. Caleb thought about all the times he had begged for a sign, for something big enough to justify believing again. He had imagined answers arriving with certainty, with force. Instead, they had come like this, unannounced, unimpressive, real. The river carried on behind them, dark and patient. Snow continued to fall, light and forgiving. Caleb took a breath that reached deeper than the ones before it. He understood now why people missed their angels. They were too busy looking for wings. And not enough people noticed the ones who showed up quietly, did what needed to be done, and walked away without asking to be remembered. Atlas lay back down, satisfied. Henry turned toward his truck. Eleanor picked up her bag of bread and scattered a few pieces along the path. Life resumed, not with a dramatic ending, but with a gentle continuation. And for the first time in a long while, Caleb didn't feel abandoned by the silence. He felt accompanied. There's a question people ask quietly, usually after the story is over. Why did it take so long? Why didn't he come back sooner? Why did the help arrive only after the damage was done? Why does healing always seem late? Caleb had asked himself the same thing, sitting alone on the bench, watching the river move without him. He had replayed the years like a ledger, counting what might have been saved if time had been kinder. But standing there now, with Atlas beside him and the cold air settling into his bones, he began to understand something that had never made sense before. Some returns, if they come too early, can't save anyone. When people are still fighting to look strong, they don't know how to receive what would heal them. They mistake comfort for weakness. They push away hands that try to help. They tell themselves they're fine because admitting otherwise feels like failure. Caleb had lived there for a long time. Back when the memories were loud and his body was still wired for survival, nothing could have reached him. Not words, not reunion, not even love. Anything that came close would have bounced off the armor he didn't know how to take off. If Atlas had returned then, it wouldn't have brought peace. It would have reopened a wound that hadn't stopped bleeding. Healing doesn't begin when the pain first appears. It begins when pretending stops. When the nights get quiet enough for the truth to be heard. When a person finally admits they're tired of carrying everything alone. When strength loosens its grip just enough to let something else in. The bench had taught Caleb that. So had the river, the long afternoons, the silence he once resented and now understood as preparation. The return didn't come to pull him backward into who he used to be. It came when he was ready to move forward as who he was now. That's what late returns do. They don't erase the past. They don't rewrite it. They don't give back what was lost. They give something different. They give permission. Permission to stop proving. Permission to rest. Permission to continue. Atlas hadn't come back to make the war make sense. He hadn't come back to fix guilt or justify survival. He had come back to anchor Caleb in the present, to remind him that life was still asking something of him. Not heroics, not sacrifice, just presence. And that's why it worked, because by the time the return happened, Caleb wasn't trying to be strong anymore. He was simply ready to be human. The river moved steadily beside them, unchanged and patient. Snow drifted down in soft intervals, settling where it would, melting when it had to. Nothing rushed, nothing forced its way in. Some things arrive late because they are precise, because they know exactly when you'll be ready to receive them. And when they do, they don't pull you back into the life you lost. They help you step into the one you still have. This part isn't about Caleb anymore. It's about the people who watched the story and felt something stir in places they don't usually touch. Somewhere, a kitchen light is still on long after midnight. A coat hangs by the door that no one has worn in years. A phone stays charged just in case. There are families who learned how to set one less plate without ever saying the reason out loud. Parents who memorized the sound of a driveway long before the car stopped coming. Children who grew up measuring time by absence instead of birthdays. And there are people who came home, but only halfway. They sit at work meetings. They laugh at the right moments. They nod when asked how they're doing. But parts of them never cross the same line their bodies did. Pieces stayed behind in heat and noise and decisions made too fast to name. This is for them. Not as an answer, not as closure, just as acknowledgement. The bench by the river doesn't belong to one man. It belongs to everyone who has waited on something that didn't arrive when it was supposed to. Everyone who learned to sit still because moving felt too dangerous. Some returns don't make headlines. They happen quietly, in the way someone finally sleeps through the night, in the way a dog lifts its head at a familiar sound, in the way a breath comes easier without being noticed, and some returns haven't happened yet. That doesn't mean they won't. The world has a strange patience. It doesn't force timing. It doesn't explain itself. It just keeps space open longer than we think it should. If you're watching this and there's someone you're still waiting for, you're not doing it wrong. Waiting isn't weakness. It's a form of care that refuses to expire. If you're watching this and you're the one who hasn't come back yet, not fully, not all the way, that doesn't make you broken. It means something important stayed behind because it mattered. Caleb didn't find peace by going back. He found it by standing where he was, long enough for the rest of life to catch up. And that's the part people don't say often enough. Coming home isn't a moment. It's a permission you give yourself, sometimes years later. The river keeps moving. Snow falls whether anyone watches it or not. Benches wait without asking questions. Nothing here demands an ending. So if this story touched something in you, you don't have to explain it. You don't have to comment the right words or share more than you want to. But if you feel like it, you can leave a name, a place, a quiet acknowledgement that you're here, or that you're waiting, or that you finally made it back in ways no one else can see. And if not, that's okay too. Some letters are meant to be read silently. Some returns are still on their way. The bench will be there.